Like I said, I'm going to continue talking about the period of the Great Depression with the New Deal era, with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Congress developing all these different various programs that they have. Anyway, of course, it's kind of a continuation of the same PowerPoint slide I had before overall. And yeah, the New Deal era is usually divided into two periods. They have what they call the first New Deal. Usually that's like sets of programs that came out between about 1933 to 35. And then the second New Deal is around like 35, 36 to about maybe 38 or so, roughly. And really about World War II, they stopped doing all those programs because some were working and some weren't, that kind of deal. Some were declared unconstitutional, like the NRA, which I'll talk about first, of course, as an example. So let's go ahead and talk about, because some of these I've already talked about, I think, in that list. But on the bottom, I don't think I got to talking about the National Industrial Recovery Act, which came out in 1933. It created the so-called National Recovery Administration. That was considered one of the centerpiece programs of the New Deal. In fact, it was one of the first ones that actually came out. What the NIRA did was it was created to basically stimulate industrial production in the United States, which had fallen off, since the Great Depression and all that. And it was supported by an alliance of basically industries across the United States that had the backing from the federal government. So it had like all these different corporations and companies that dealt with the government and wanted people to, do business with them. And all that. And you can see it did all kinds of things. It sought to promote fair competition, raise wages and prices, institute collective bargaining, which it would do. Of course, it created codes of fair competition, more or less. Of course, it had the National Recovery Administration was, of course, like I said, part of it that basically was supposed to enforce it and all that. Consumers were actually advised, by the way, to only buy products from those places that displayed the NRA name and symbol, basically. You see there, which had a blue eagle with like a wheel and lightning bolts. Usually it had a motto with it, which you don't have it there, but sometimes they'd have a motto that would say underneath, it would say, "We do our part." You'd see it. Usually it was like a blue looking sticker, actually, not black and white. Yeah, there's one right here. Actually, it looks like more like the one. If you go to the next slide, which is right here, there it is right there. We do our part. Yeah, and so if we're an NRA, remember, do business with us and all that. So the Congress appropriated like $500 million was also, of course, also used too, which was also, the money was used to help out the needy. And so some of these are all part of, this, and that they spent like a lot of money, the NRA, in trying to, boost manufacturing. You can see they spent billions of dollars and all that trying to do all this. And of course, the NRA had a lot of critics on all that. Some people were accused of being almost like a form of socialism or something like that. What happened eventually was that, if you know about it, in May of 1935, it was declared unconstitutional in a Supreme Court case called Schechter versus United States. Supreme Court basically said that the federal government really had no right to regulate every business aspect. Maybe some things, but like everything. It was trying to regulate the whole economy. Yeah, almost like a form of like socialism or social democracy, maybe, or something like that. And so that got rid of that. But there was this other thing they kept behind, if you know much about it. I don't know if I have a slide on that or not. Yeah, I do, which is right here. They had what they called the Wagner Act, which was part of it, which was called the National Labor Relations. It led to the so-called creation of the National Labor Relations Board, which you see there. I think it's right here. But The NLRB, as it's called, was this arbitration board that was used to settle disputes, like labor disputes between workers and businesses. And one thing that was famous about I guess the NIRA and all that stuff with the Wagner Act was that it was, if you study about it, the Wagner Act was one of the first things to really give unions the right to collectively bargain with businesses. So it's like the federal government started recognizing that they were labor unions, that workers were collectivizing, as a form of labor, and so collective bargaining was made legal, pretty much with that. So that really gave labor a lot of power, especially when World War II broke out, and started building a lot of industries for the war effort, and so it made the rise of unions very powerful, especially after World War II, as you get like in the 1950s and the 1960s. And it's important because it later led to the rise in workers' wages overall. And it's still like that today with a lot of labor unions, like the auto manufacturing, whatever. They have high wages because of labor unions and stuff like that. But a lot of places are trying to get rid of labor unions, if you know about that, of course, today. Another thing that was also a part of the New Deal, which you may have heard about, which is still around today, by the way. I think the NLRB is still around, I believe. But the SEC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission, is something you've probably heard about, which is still around today. Of course, it was part of an act called the Securities and Exchange Act, which came out in 1934. This was all created because of, it was all created because of the stock market crash, which had happened in 1929. And so basically, they were trying to help, protect investors from getting their money taken, the stock market. And so that's part of what it was for. It was also there to help the national banking system as well. So that's why they created the SEC. So it regulated the stock market. Also, of course, those slide I had earlier on, that's another thing it did too. It also regulated the electronics securities market, because a lot of trading on the stock market is done electronically, using computers and internet and stuff like that, not just by phone, etc. And then also, of course, the SEC, which you may have seen. Maybe you've seen that movie. You ever seen the movie Wall Street? I think it was made, I want to say, in the 1980s. It's a pretty good movie. They crack down on insider trading and stuff like that, where people get special information about stock and things like that, which is illegal, So that's what the SEC is. Of course, you think of like football SEC, but this is a different kind of SEC, of course. Now, they also had, of course, famously, which I'll mention a little bit about, which is the REA, which is the Rural Electric Administration. I don't know if you ever heard about that, but it was also a part of the New Deal, part of the second New Deal, which came out in 1936, roughly. And if you know about the rural areas, very isolated, like my mother lived out in the country for years, like in Point Capee Parish. Very isolated back in the 1930s, mostly dirt roads and stuff like that. A lot of farming communities, of course, there's no electricity. There's no phone service either. There's no bathroom. You had outhouse, stuff like that. I remember my mom telling me about that. They didn't have a lot of things. They had a well, I think, for water, stuff like that. But they think that, of course, the REA would help them later get electricity and phone service, after that. And so this was an important act that basically provided electricity for rural areas across America. And what it did was it basically got all these, it got funding for these cooperative electric power companies to start, creating electricity and building power lines to different, isolated areas throughout the country. That was very important because it helped to modernize, the rural areas, especially for farming, ranching communities, things like that. Not just around here, but all over the United States that didn't have electrical or phone service, stuff like that. And you can see by 1950, more than 80% of American farms had electricity. So yeah, obviously that's what it was more geared toward. It's trying to get electricity. Now, the only problem they had was that they had to use 7,200 volt distributing network, which is pretty high, because normally most cities would have about 2,300 volts they would use. So they obviously had to use that with more expensive type transformers to get electricity to people. It was more expensive to do that, but it was something that they wanted to do to try to modernize the whole country and get people in the, 20th century more or less. They think a lot of this was influenced by the TVA, which was something that the New Deal was famous for. REA, I don't think is around anymore, but the TVA is. I don't think REA is around, but TVA is still around. I know, of course, Tennessee Valley Authority, and this was part of an act, congressional act, one of the first ones that came out, 1933, the New Deal, which constructed a system of like dams and locks along the Tennessee River. Tennessee River was known for a lot of flood problems, so this was all done to create flood control on the Tennessee River Valley, which went Tennessee and parts of like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, where the Tennessee River actually went and its tributaries. It also provided cheap electricity using hydroelectricity from the dams, and over time you can see that the TVA was able to service an area which was like something like, I guess, about 6-7 states: Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, even Kentucky, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, all got electric power from it. And some people liked it that lived in the area, but there were critics of the New Deal that didn't like it. Because they thought they basically thought that it didn't reach everybody. It was just for a certain area, and they're kind of angry about that. And they thought that it could, electricity could be, for other people throughout, the whole country, more or less. And there are a lot of critics that thought that the private industry couldn't make any money there, competition, dealing with electric power companies there, because the government basically had price controlling there over cheap electricity. So I think the government kind of went, I know a lot of businesses weren't happy about that, but TVA is still there, still dominant. People still got a lot of electricity, of course, from these dams that they built, of course, a long time ago. You can see in the Appalachian Mountains, they were able to even get some electricity later as well. Because of it. All right, the next thing I need to get into is I need to talk about the second New Deal. That's basically starting at that point, which comes in. And of course, one of the first things I need to talk about is you have these people, of course, that are against the New Deal that don't like it. They're, of course, referred to as a nickname, which you may have heard of, and they're called the anti-New Dealers. These were people that were critics of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs he developed with Congress. And these were a mix of people. Some were politicians, and then some were just, American citizens, et cetera, that were basically concerned about the policies. Some, they think they wanted new changes that were different from what FDR wanted, and some thought they had gone too far, and that some of his programs are almost like socialism, basically. Well, one of the first they always talk about, which is famous, is Father Charles Coughlin. Yeah, Coughlin. He, of course, was very famous overall. I think I've got a picture of him right here, Father Coughlin. And, of course, they gave him a nickname. He was known as the Radio Priest. And I don't know if you know much about Father Coughlin. He had this radio show that he had in Detroit, Michigan. Originally from Canada, by the way. He came to America. And he would hold these weekly radio shows. And at first, Father Coughlin was for the New Deal. He supported FDR, I think, in the first couple years. And then they think around 1934, 35, he became disillusioned about the New Deal. And Coughlin believed that the banking industry was part of the problem in the country, and it had basically caused the Great Depression. He believed it needed to be replaced, the Fed, to get rid of it. Or maybe if they didn't get rid of it, he thought that also that maybe it should be overhauled or something like that. So that was one of his main policies I think he talked about on his show sometimes. Also, another thing too is that he was very popular with just the average person in the country. And you can often compare Father Coughlin to, you've heard of Rush Limbaugh, right? Rush Limbaugh, he, of course, a very famous radio guy who, of course, conservative politics, of course. He has a lot of viewers, like 40, 50 million people that listen to Rush Limbaugh or more. Father Coughlin had a lot too. He had maybe 30, 40 million people that at one point listened to it, like in the 1930s. So he had a lot of people. However, what happened was he declined in popularity because of World War II. And Father Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest, was kind of anti-Semitic, kind of would sometimes rant about the Jews because he thought the Jews were all behind the banking stuff. You know, a lot of fascists think that way, like Hitler, I know, thought that the Jews were all in control of the banks and all that. And so FDR later had his show canceled because he was just kind of considered too pro-fascist because he would support policies of Mussolini and Hitler overall, some of his radio broadcasts. And so he kind of declined by like 1939 and all that, but he was very popular on the radio. Was one of the most famous of the anti-New Dealers at one point. I think I've got another slide on him if you want to look at it, which is right here. But yeah, 30, 40 something million people would listen to it. And you can see some other things he wanted. Yeah, he called for heavy taxes on the wealthy. So this guy wasn't exactly pro-capitalist guy. Like he actually wanted to get rid of capitalism, believe it or not. So anyway, yeah, he's later arrested too during World War II for violating the Espionage Act. Wow. So this stuff like that. So yeah, he was kind of on the wrong side, I guess, later when World War II came later. Right. Then they had, of course, Dr. Francis Townsend. He was, of course, also very famous during the anti-New Dealer period, into the second New Deal, more or less. And Dr. Francis Townsend, he was an elderly California doctor. He may have been retired, I believe, at the time. He was older, and he campaigned to try to get help for the elderly of the United States because he felt like most of the elderly have been forgotten, especially during the Great Depression. And he believed that they ought to get some kind of retirement pension. So he came up with this idea that's called the Townsend Plan. And the Townsend Plan was an idea where that basically the federal government would give people that were over 60 a pension, like a $200 pension, which would be financed, you can see, through a national sales tax, like a 2% one. And so each pensioner would be required to spend the money in 30 days, and this would help to stimulate the economy. So the Townsend Plan was an idea that they do think that later led to the idea of Social Security, which of course would, I think, be created around the same time, more or less. And there's a lot of like seniors, like older people that really got involved in this and were big followers of Dr. Francis Townsend and his ideas, more or less. All right, then there was the one that was the one you may have heard of course, who's the most famous of the, at least for us, like down here in Louisiana, which is Huey P. Long. He, of course, is considered for us one of the most famous of the anti-New Dealers, of course, known as the Kingfish. Of course, Huey P. Long, governor, senator of Louisiana, governor of the state about those years, 1928 to about 1932, roughly. And Huey P. Long was practically, in his, democratic machine, was almost like a dictator in Louisiana. He had total control over the state. However, if you know much about Huey P. Long, he was considered to be a populist type candidate. And a lot of people, don't think about this. They think about those negative things like that. But Long was very instrumental in modernizing the state of Louisiana. Like you could kind of talk about a bunch of things that he did, but he helped promote a lot of the schools, like just local schools, also universities. His pet project, about that, was Louisiana State University, the old war school. And I think Long was the one that developed the, LSU's marching band they got, the Golden Band from Tigerland. He pretty much helped develop it, and their uniforms, like the way the uniforms are, he pretty much developed it, more or less. Also, like you think about like today, you have state subsidized lunch programs. He developed that also as well, where kids can have lunch free usually, and he built thousands of roads because like throughout Louisiana, most of Louisiana was like dirt, gravel type roads. And so Long started, to build roads. He also built bridges across the Mississippi River, like in New Orleans. He built the Huey P. Long Bridge. The one in Baton Rouge, of course, named after him. I think they built that one afterwards, but that was something he also helped to kind of start developing as well. And don't forget the Louisiana State Capitol. That was something Long also helped to develop as well. So all those kind of things he did do, of course, which is very famous. Of course, Long was, like I said, he was like this populist candidate, very popular governor and later a senator as well. So a lot of the lower classes really looked up to Huey P. Long, who was, by the way, from North Louisiana, originally where he's from. And he came up with this program you may have heard of that's called the Share Our Wealth Program. It was an idea to help people in the Great Depression. And basically, the idea was to take a lot of the wealth, like of the, all the Rockefellers and all these people that have a lot of money, and give it back to the people, basically. And so he came up with this idea to levy 100% tax on all personal income that was over $1 million. It's pretty amazing. And so a lot of the money would go to help the impoverished people as well, was the idea. And you could actually join. It was like a club or something like that. I think you could join it. And they had a slogan as well that was called, which I'll give you. The slogan of the Share Our Wealth program was "Every man a king, but no man wears a crown." And Huey Long had this idea that people could, average people could actually live like kings if they wanted to. So like I said, he was a very popular politician. And later he was elected to the U.S. Senate, if you know about this. He went to Washington. However, he was kind of seen as a kind of a clown or a buffoon to a lot of people. He was known for giving a lot of long-winded speeches, which were very comical. He was also known for, they'd have a filibuster or something like that, the Democrats. He's one that usually do a filibuster and just would talk forever, basically. So that's who Huey P. Long was. And Long could have been, if you study about him, he could have been a threat to, of course, FDR's administration, like in the 1936 election. And at one point, he thought about running for president. I don't know if you ever heard about this, but he wrote a book, Huey Long, that's called the Every Man a King, which was, I think, published in 1935. And he talked about what he was going to do if he became president and all of that. And there's more information about the share of the wealth program you can see. So basically, it even limited people's inheritances. You can only have up to $5 million each. Guaranteed every family an annual income of $2,000. Free college education and vocational training. Old age pensions for all persons over 60. Veterans benefits and health care. 30-hour work week. A 4-week vacation for every worker. So some of these ideas sounds like Bernie Sanders, huh? You think he was a socialist. He really wasn't, Huey Long, but a lot of these were progressive ideas, I guess, that the Kingfish had. And I guess he could have done some of these ideas later, maybe. But if you know about it, he was assassinated in 1935. A man named Dr. Carl Weiss shot him. Of course, if you know about it, in the Louisiana Capitol building, he actually came up there with maybe a pistol, they think, on the first floor, I think close to the governor's office, shot Long point blank, September 8th, 1935. And Long had a bunch of bodyguards. They opened up on him and shot him up with riddled with bullets, Carl Weiss. Of course, there's been speculation about that Weiss didn't have a gun, and that what really happened was Weiss slapped Long. They think that happened, maybe, and his bodyguards opened up on him. So who knows? But they think a bullet ricocheted. I think they say that what really happened was that maybe if Weiss didn't shoot him, a bullet ricocheted off the marble walls, if you know about that, in the Capitol building. And basically, it later caused Long to die, of course, later from an infection, they think. Because I think it looked like he was going to live, but of course he died after from complications. Yeah, that was the famous quote that Long supposedly said, some of his last words, but he said, "God, don't let me die. I have so much to do." So he was really young when he died, Huey Long. All right, so moving on, let me talk about a few more things about FDR in the, of course, of the New Deal. Now, there's a few other things I need to discuss. Let me talk about the 1936 election. That really wasn't much of an election to really talk about. Well, I'll just briefly talk about it. But basically, FDR ran in 1936 with very little opposition. Pretty much a landslide type election. The only guy that really gave him any really toughness, I guess, was Alf Landon, who came from Kansas. I think he was the governor of Kansas, and eventually he was nominated by the Republicans to run against the Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt. And what Alf Landon realized at one point was that basically he claimed that the New Deal wasn't really fixing the Great Depression. That was pretty much his claim, more or less. What Landon came up with, the idea, of course, was that he felt like he could do better. And so that became his slogan, "I can do it better," more or less. But FDR was just too popular. His New Deal programs were popular with people, even though maybe sometimes they weren't really working like they should. And so Roosevelt, FDR went on to defeat Alf Landon in another landslide election, 472 electoral votes to 53 electoral votes. I think FDR had several landslide victories, and so it wasn't even close, with that. All right, moving on. So that here's a map if you want to look at it later. Well, that's what the map looked like, and you can see, God, Roosevelt won just about every state except Vermont and Maine. That's amazing. So pretty interesting about that. That's the 40. I don't think the other two were there, Alaska, Hawaii. So that's basically amazing. So 46 out of 48 states he won. Right. Yeah. Let me get in also and talk about the second New Deal, which were some other, like I said, New Deal programs that came later, like 35 to 36, up to about 37, 38, 1938, roughly. These are some of the ones that were kind of famous. They're in alphabetical order. They have the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1937, the United, the USHA, of course, which is the United States Housing Authority, also in 1937. So there's some of those ones that they had also as well that I'll talk about for a little bit. And the first one I'll talk about, which I think I may have talked about already, which I guess I'll cover it again because I got information for you. There's some security. Let me go to this one first. I don't know if I got to talk about the second one, but they had the Agricultural Adjustment Act, of course, of 1938, which is right here. This one over here was declared unconstitutional. So they got rid of this one, which is right here. And it was replaced in 1938 with the second AAA, which is here. It did a lot of different things, more or less. You can see purpose, recovery for agriculture, paid farmers for conservation practices, but only if they restricted production of staple crops. If you want more information about it, I can add it on the screen. Well, here's some more, but basically what it did, it replaced the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, like I told you, that had been declared unconstitutional. A lot of what it did was it provided payments to farmers in proportion to acres they withdrew from production. So that's something they did. And then they also, another couple things they did, which was interesting, was they decided the amount of crops to be produced each year. It's almost like the government getting into almost like socialism, more or less, with crop production. Provided storage for crops considered too large. So if a farmer produced too many crops, they would store it because they're kind of concerned that if there's too much crop, that'll cause the price of the commodities to go down because they want it to stay up. Now, one thing that's very famous about the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938 was that he was one of the first to insure crops, like for farmers, like if something happened. So severe drought, bad weather, plant disease, things like that, of course, were new things that they did that was well known. And also flood. Okay, so floods come and stuff like that as well. So that's something that's very famous for overall. Also, they got something which I think, let me go down here. Where is it? There it is right there. They have the Fair Labor Standards Act. That was another thing that came out that was part of the second New Deal that's well known, which this I think is still around, of course. And what that did, the FLSA, what it did was it provided a minimum wage scale. That's a typo. Let me put that in there. But it provided a minimum wage scale, basically, in the United States, more or less. And so that's the one that pretty much does that today, the United States. Also provided a maximum work week, like the amount of hours that would be what we call full time, which originally was 44 hours, is what it was when it first came out around 1938, I guess, when it went into effect. And then by 1940, it was reduced to 40 hours, which is mostly what it is now. Also, it's set like the, if you want to know about like worker overtime rules, etc., it also set that too, like what it is in the United States business-wise. Also prevented employment of children under 16. They had to be 16 and older a lot of times to work. So for a business or something like that. So they're trying to get rid of child labor and things like that. So yeah, so I had that too right there. But yeah, it set overtime rates, and stuff like that also as well. So it's still around. It's still around. The Fair Labor's standard thing is still around. And it's pretty much, like I said, enforced by our own government. federal government through the Department of Labor, pretty much. Right. Also, another. I need to talk about. It's in there somewhere about the United States Housing Authority. That's something else that's also well known. That was also created as well, which came out in 1937. That was, of course, part of the Second New Deal. That's right here, and that was passed by Congress. And what it did was it created this. Basically, a program, was a federal program to create a lot of low-cost housing construction, which they provided about $500 million in loans to help out people, especially those that are maybe more poor, couldn't afford the money for more expensive type housing. And this was all done to create houses because there was a shortage of housing in the United States. It's a big problem they had from like the 1930s. I want to say after the 1950s, there was a shortage of housing, more or less. And so you can see they could get loans at low interest on 60-year terms. Seriously, some of these were ridiculous what they could get. And I think my father in the 1960s got some loans I know that were like 1%, some crazy low number, which is ridiculous because now maybe you can get 3-4% range at the lowest, more or less. And a lot of these were geared towards urban areas throughout the United States. But by the way, during World War II, they built a lot of housing. They lent out a lot of money later on as well. So they built in World War II. The USHA built like something like 150,000 housing units across the United States. So it was a lot. But you see down there, it says, of course, that it was still difficult for minorities to acquire sometimes these loans, which were done through banks. So they get low interest through banks, but sometimes they wouldn't want to give it to them. So that's the only thing about that that was a problem. I thought there's one thing I left out that I didn't talk about. Where is it? I don't think it's. Oh, there's one more thing I didn't talk about, which I need to talk about. I almost forgot about it. Also, they have the. Where is it? Somewhere in here. Now, where are you? I must have passed it up. But there's also one more thing. I don't know where it is. No, it's in here somewhere. But I want to talk about Social Security. I thought I talked about that, but I guess I didn't talk about it. For some reason, I must have left it out. But they also have Social Security. There it is, which is right there, which came out in 1935. So that was also part of the Second New Deal as well. And of course, Social Security was set up, if you know about this, to help the elderly because of the Townsend plan that, Francis Townsend came up with, more or less. So these are all the things it mostly did. You can see, but it provided unemployment insurance, pensions for retirees, and it provided help for the handicapped. So that's the three main things it does the most, more or less. And so, yeah, like if you lose your job, there's unemployment insurance, things like that that they've got as well. And then for workers, they would using like obviously their income tax, they would put money away for a pension around after the age of 65, which I think now it's 67 that you can get the full pension amount check from the federal government. So it doesn't include health insurance. You see there, of course, with that. Of course, they later would add like Medicaid, Medicare, which that wasn't FDR. That was under LBJ. Developed that later, of course, in the 1960s. So Social Security is still around, today. That's a big program, probably one of the biggest programs that survived from that period under the New Deal. I think that one in the SEC, Security and Exchange Commission is another one. TVA is still around, I think. I'm trying to think of another that's around that's still big. I think those are the three big ones I know that are still around today. Right, I've got I think that's pretty much it for pretty much the New Deal era. One more thing, though, about the New Deal. Did it really work? People, of course, have asked that question before about it. Well, there's been a lot of critics about it over time. A lot of the voters seem to like it. They seem to think it helped solve some problems and put people to work. It probably put millions of people to work. You can see it reduced unemployment from 13 to $9 million, but I think critics believe it didn't really do enough to really, get everybody employed. And so people are also critical of it, of course, because it seemed like the government was, basically becoming directly involved in everybody's lives. You look at the bureaucracy of the federal government, like in 1930, it was only 600,000 people that worked for the government. And then by 1940, it was 1 million. And then World War II, it increased even more, probably 1 point something million. I'm sure we're working for it. So you can see those programs, like I said, like SEC, Social Security, of course, FDIC, that's another that's still around, TVA. Those are all still around. Those are things that are some of the legacies of the New Deal. American farmers are still heavily subsidized. So, those are all things that, are still kind of there with the New Deal. But a lot of historians think that the New Deal didn't really end the Depression. In fact, prosperity would not really return until really World War II, because World War II is going to help to stimulate the economy, get the industries going, agriculture to full production. And what's going to happen is by the end of World War II and into the 1950s, the United States' economy is going to become like a big boom, later. So maybe the New Deal helped start it, but they think that World War II is really what got the United States out of the Depression, more or less. All right. Now I'm going to also, for a few minutes here, I've got some time. I'm going to go ahead and also review a little bit about, the material for, I guess, the, rest of this period of the New Deal, because I guess later I might be able to have like a Canvas quiz in this period, maybe part of World War II, possibly. I'll see about that later. But let me go ahead and just review. Some of these, of course, are part of the end of the Great Depression as well. Of course, says, what was the Dust Bowl? Remember that? Of course, the Dust Bowl was this period in like the 1930s in the Midwest where there are these huge dust storms that of course, were caused by, they think, maybe over farming and overgrazing in the Midwest and the Great Plains. And so it basically destroyed the lives of a lot of farmers in the Midwest. And so a lot of them became migrants. They were called Okies. They were called Arkies. And these migrants, of course, fled the Dust Bowl, and they later went to the West, like the California and other places out west, maybe Oregon, etc. And of course, when they got there, they realized that it all wasn't all that great, like they thought it was. They thought they'd make a great, that's why they call it the Grapes of Wrath, that famous book by John Steinbeck that describes, how bad it was trying to make a living. And of course, Woody Guthrie, was a famous American folk singer who, of course, sang about, the Dust Bowl and the migrant workers, of the hobos of the Great Depression that suffered during that time. And of course, remember that song I kind of gave you to listen to at the beginning of, I think, that part 1 lecture on the Great Depression, New Deal era, when he said that, don't go to California because he said, do re mi, if you don't have any money, the do part, the dough as in money, don't go to California if you don't have any money. So now, who was blamed for the Great Depression? Of course, Herbert Hoover, of course, who had got elected in 1928. And of course, the stock market crash happened in 1929, October 29. And so he got blamed for it. And they began with these things called Hooverism, where just anything that included like poverty was kind of used to describe and blamed on him. And so Hooverville was basically a shanty town where like people that were migrants and homeless people would live in, basically. Hoover flag was like your pocket turned inside out because you don't have any money. You're broke. Hoover Pullman was like a boxcar that you lived, like hobos lived in, more or less. Hoover Hog was like it could be anything: squirrels, armadillo, something that you wouldn't really usually eat. They call it a Hoover Hog. What did Hoover what did Hoover do to alleviate the problems associated with the Great Depression? He built like building projects. Like the big thing I think I remember talked about was he constructed Boulder Dam, which was later called Hoover Dam, 1930s. Around where Nevada, Arizona is on the Colorado River Basin. He also created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was this corporation that was created by the government to give money to American businesses and put people to work, but it didn't really work. It just wasn't enough to really employ everybody. Like you saw with the Hoover Dam, it was like only 3,000 or whatever could build it. Like, what is it, 10,000 wanted a job? Crazy. So Hoover, of course, became a hermit in the White House. He thought basically that the Depression would be over. And so he kept saying prosperity is just around the corner, that kind of thing. And so he got blamed for it. Also, his administration was scarred by the bonus marchers fiasco. These were World War I veterans that marched on Washington wanting their life insurance pension early, which they weren't supposed to get it until later. They wanted it early because of the Depression. Hoover wouldn't give it to them, so they set up shanty towns like in Washington. And Hoover decided to get rid of them, and so he sent in the military under Douglas MacArthur, and it became a big fiasco. So that was something that happened under Hoover in 1932, and they think it was the Depression, the combination of the Depression and the Boner Marchers incident is pretty much what got rid of him when he lost in 1932. So in 1932, what happened was Herbert Hoover ran for re-election as the Republican nominee versus FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, of course, the governor of New York. And, of course, as you know, FDR ran on his New Deal platform, as he called it, which was there to basically try to alleviate the problems associated with the Great Depression and all of that. Anyway, FDR ran on this thing where he said that he wanted to give people relief, recovery, and reform, the so-called 3 R's, as they dub it. And anyway, of course, FDR in 1933, when he came in office, his inaugural address became very famous for his famous speech that he gave, where he said that the only thing they had to fear is fear itself. And so in the first 100 days, was a period at the beginning of the New Deal where they began to enact first New Deal programs, which involved pump priming, where the federal government borrowed a lot of money to create all these different programs to create industry, protect the banking industry, get people jobs, and so on. So yeah, the FDIC was created. The FDIC, they had the Emergency Banking Act first. The Emergency Banking Act was created first. That was created as to save the banks. They basically decided which banks they would get rid of and which ones they would save. They would have like a banking holiday. FDIC, of course, created to ensure deposits and make sure people put money in the bank. Of course, the FDIC is still around, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. They had the WPA. The WPA was called the Works Progress Administration. That was created in 1933. It was done, of course, to employ people building things like schools, sewage plants, roads, things like that, industry, and so on. So that was one. They also had the Public Works Administration also as well, which was similar to it, which did a lot of building projects. Like it built bridges, government buildings, power plants, conservation projects, dams. I think they built also like naval ships and so on. Civilian Conservation Corps is also set up too as well. That was one where nation's youth were involved, I think 17 or 18, about 25, and they were employed doing conservation projects, planting forests, clearing swamps, building small dams, creating public parks. National Youth Administration was another one too. That was where high school students were hired to do work around schools. They created like thousands of jobs. Farm Credit Administration was another one. This was created to enable farmers to get cheap loans for farms to protect their homes, their farms, and loans could be as high as 50 years. And the interest rates were down about 2.5%. Also, they have the Agricultural Adjustment Administration Act, 1933. This was all done by FDR to reduce the supply of farm products because they think that caused the Great Depression. And what the AAA was done, it was created to basically pay farmers not to grow crops. It was pretty much the idea, but it was heavily criticized, and it was later declared unconstitutional by United States versus Butler. Homeowners Loan Corporation was another one that was also very famous as well. That one was created to give people cheap loans for their homes, and HOLC, it was called. That came out in 1933. So that was one that was very famous as well. And it was done to prevent foreclosures on homes. People could get cheap interest rates on mortgages, etc. And that also, I told you, they also had the FHA, which was also called the Federal Housing Administration. They also created that to encourage banks to loan people money as well to build houses, repair houses. However, I told you how minorities were kind of discriminated against. What else? NIRA, I talked about that. National Recovery Administration, of course, created from that. What that basically did was it created a NRA, which controlled industrial output in the country. And so it gave the government a right to control like the amount of industry in the country, the amount of hours worked, the amount of wages paid, and so on. And one of the things that's very famous about it, they created the NLRB, which is the National Labor Relations Board, which is the Wagner Act. And what this act basically did was it allowed arbitration between the labor unions and businesses. And so basically the federal government at this point started to recognize labor unions in the United States. And that's something new. And that'll later give unions more power. It'll later lead to higher wages, of course, in the United States in general. Also, SEC, of course, SEC Act, Securities Exchange Commission, that was developed to, of course, regulate the stock exchange, the stock market, more or less, prevent insider trading and things like that. Rural Electrification Administration, I told you that, was developed to aid farmers, get phone service, electrical service to farmers, rural areas, ranchers, things like that, because most of the United States was very rural. Most people didn't have electricity unless you were like in the cities. TVA, of course, told you about that. Tennessee Valley Authority, that was created to create cheap electricity, of course, in the Tennessee River Valley area in the United States. The TVA was also created to create flood control on the Tennessee River, which included about 24 large dams that were built, and also lock systems that were also built on the river system. Then we talked about the Second New Deal. Second New Deal, of course, we kind of went into that. And those are some of the anti-New Dealers that were famous. Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest. He was the one that was against FDR's ideas, and he wanted to get rid of like the Federal Reserve and stuff like that, as an example. But Townsend was kind of anti-Semitic and kind of pro-fascist, which later got him canned. But he basically was like a 1930s version of Rush Limbaugh, having 30, 40 million people listening to him or so. Dr. Francis Townsend was this elderly California man, that doctor that wanted to have a pension plan for the elderly over 60. And they believe the Townsend plan was an idea that influenced later Social Security. Huey Long, of course, governor, senator of Louisiana, known as the Kingfish. Long was a very famous populist type candidate in Louisiana. He worked, tirelessly to try and modernize the state, more or less, like with the schools, the roads, hospitals, building bridges in general. But Long was considered kind of like a dictator of Louisiana because his Democratic Party machine really had a lot of power in the country. And Long, of course, was known for his Share Our Wealth program, which was this idea to take a lot of the wealth of the rich people and give it to like Americans, like give money back to Americans to help the impoverished, especially. And Long believed that people shouldn't have money over $1 million and that the rest should basically go to people. Of course, who shot Huey Long? Long, of course, was killed in 1935 at the Louisiana State Capitol. He was shot by Dr. Carl Weiss, who, of course, was a political opponent of his. So anyway, so that basically is, of course, the New Deal era we're talking about. Pretty much just about out of time here for today, but that's going to wrap up this historical period, the Great Depression and the New Deal, part 1 and part 2. Later this week, hopefully, I'll get to it. I'm going to, of course, start to move on to talk about the World War II era, because the United States is going to, of course, get into World War II because of Japan and what Germany's doing, of course, in Europe and all that. So that's going to be my next step, pretty much going next overall. But before I go, I want to remind you, don't forget about completing assignments. That's due. I think there's one due. I told you this week, the one on the World War I quiz. That, of course, needs to be done, more or less. And then I did put up the second exam early. So if you want to start working on that, that's not going to be due for a while. I think till the end of next week sometime, probably. But I have already posted that already if you want to start working on that right now. So that's about it. I'm not sure what's going to happen with the weather, but just, keep checking the weather. They got that Hurricane Zeta out there, I know, that's coming. So it's going to be interesting to see if that affects us or not. The school and all that. So that's about it. Hope y'all having a good week, and y'all take care. If you have any comments, questions about this lecture, let me know. If you got some kind of comments, you just go ahead and send me a message, because I am going to post this video to my lecture, of course, to my YouTube channel and all that. You can take a look at it for later. And that's it for today. So y'all take care and see you later.